Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another IAFA virtual discussion on a topic which is hitting the headlines on television, newspapers, and if you watch, some of the scenes are really unbearable. We have very eminent panel. I don't think we could have got any much higher profile than this. Welcome, Dr. Tharoor is there, so our panel is complete on dot. So I was just saying we couldn't have thought of a much better panel. Dr. Tharoor needs no introduction. He is everywhere. You see him on television, you read his articles, you read his books, and you read his what you call glossary of word, for which you have to look for dictionary and whatnot. And he, as you know, another Senate opinion was supposed to come. He can't come. Mr. Swatan Das Gupta has informed that after Parliament he is meeting, so he won't be able to come. So Senate Stephen and PhD at 22 from Fletcher School, Dr. University, 28 years with the UN, 23 books, 3 terms of Parliament, member for Suhasini from Kerala, in a very leading light of Congress party. People say that he gingerly moving to the ginger group of G23. I'm not so sure, but papers speculate all the time. Then we have Ambassador Shyam Saran. He again needs no introduction. He was Foreign Secretary. He was a Prime Minister's special envoy on climate change and nuclear affairs. And he has post-retirement chaired so many things. He was chairman of RIS. He was chairman of National Security Advisory Board. And he is currently senior fellow at the CPR. And also he writes, he's a life trustee for IIC and so many other places. Just yesterday, he wrote in Times of India, Sunday Times, that China's limitless support to Russia has its own limits. He has been writing. Actually, all the participants today, they have all been writing about Ukraine crisis for last 3-4 weeks. So we will have different viewpoints. Like Prof. Raj, I didn't know that you were a nuclear scientist. I mean, if you continue with nuclear physics, you could have had your name on some of the nukes rather than really giving lectures in JNU in Singapore. In his MA and PhD international relations, he has been serious academic scholar, consulting editor, and columnist who contributes to Indian papers as well as to the Foreign Policy magazine. He was founding director of Carnegie India. He was director of Center for South Asian Studies and National University of Singapore. He has been associated with IDSA, ORF, and National Security Advisory Board. Currently, he is senior fellow at the Asia Society Institute in New Delhi. He is considered one of the most respected strategic thinkers of India today. After doing Samudra Manthan, he found Modi's world, which is expanding India's sphere of influence. Now we have Suhasini Haidar. She again needs no introduction. She has made herself a household name with her worldview program. She's a national leader, diplomatic editor of Hindu, and she has been very kind, supportive of IAFA. She has been participating in functions at different places, from Nehru Memorial to ISC and to virtual. So we have a very strong panel. I see the former Home Secretary Padmanabhiya sir has joined from Hyderabad. So right. I think I will begin with Professor Raja Mohan. Today 26 days. We have seen devastation. We have seen Mariupol, what is going on there. Now you have supersonic missile being used, long-term missile being used. The people say the art house bombed or a school bomb, hospital bomb. What's going on after 26 days? Because Russians have not got a clear victory as they might have thought, and there is no chance of absolute surrender, though Zelensky has certainly climbed down. He has publicly said he is prepared to give up a dream of joining NATO. He is also perhaps prepared to recognize Crimea, but other issues, he openly even today talked about direct talk with Putin, and he has urged everybody whoever is available to mediate and try to bring this madness, death dance to an end. So I don't know how to see it and how it is affecting not only Ukraine and Russia, the EU, EU, NATO, US, all the countries, including India, and international order. Over to you, Professor Mohan.
Thank you, Ambassador Kumar. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this very distinguished panel. So given the long list of speakers, let me be brief and focus on 5 aspects of the current situation. The first one, I want to say a few words about the military dynamic on the ground. Second, I'll look at the potential for what diplomatic solutions to the war. Third, looking at some of the emerging internal contradictions on both sides, and the nature of the external coalitions that are supporting both sides. And finally, a bit on the implications for India. On the military dynamic, quite clearly, if President Putin thought this is a brief expedition to force a quick surrender of the regime in Kiev, and it was just a matter of just demonstrating some force, and that things would just simply fall into his lap. But what we've seen after 26 days, the Russian military campaign has been purely from a military perspective, has been pretty dismal. Very underwhelming. That it had serious underestimation of the ground situation. Its logistic capabilities, its planning, and the way it has executed this mission have all, been pretty underwhelming for a country that is supposed to have this fabulous military power. But the slowdown and of the Russian military campaign against the resistance from the Ukrainians does not mean Russia is going to lose this or Ukraine is going to win this in the near term. We've seen a change in the tactics of Russia from the hopes for a quick victory to now virtually flattening the cities, of targeting the civilian, whatever you can find, and using missiles, long-range artillery to rain devastation on Ukraine to force a settlement. So this is really a brutal war, and that too taking place in Europe, of course. So this looks like, you would assume that in a few weeks, if this continues in the present situation, Putin would have flattened the ground. And the fact that he has nuclear weapons has significantly limited the ability of NATO to step in. They've said very clearly they will not. They're not going to fight a nuclear weapon power on its borders. And Putin is constantly threatening the nuclear option, initially putting them on alert, and more recently doing an evacuation drill and the use of hypersonic weapons. So if you think of escalation dominance over a period of time, if Putin, having come this far and incurred quite a bit of wrath, if he goes whole hog, then you should expect him to win. But he might win the Ukrainian territory, but not sure if he will win peace in Ukraine. And that's where my sense is some form of resistance might be expected to continue as we look down the road. So this is going to be even more uglier than what we've seen in the last 4 weeks, nearly 4 weeks. Second, is there a diplomatic solution? And I think a lot of headlines that a solution is around the corner. The Israelis, the Turks have said today things are moving forward. But I think, as most of you who worked in the governments know, one thing to have general principles, but it's another thing to translate them into actual outcomes. And nothing is done till everything is done. And here, I think facile assumptions, it's all just about NATO, or just about neutrality, those can be done. I think are not going to be as simple as they look. But the basic solutions, the outlines were visible even before the war. Probably if the both sides were more reasonable, you could have done something. One was the question of Ukraine's membership of NATO. Second was the question of security guarantees for Ukraine. The third was the question of the internal political organization of Ukraine, that is the rights of the Russian-speaking minorities. And three, the external relationship of Ukraine to the West in general, and beyond that, a whole series of arms control and stabilizing measures between Russia and the West, including the United States. But at this point, the notion of a neutrality can just simply be the one that's going to facilitate this is unlikely, because neutrality has multiple meanings. There are multiple examples of neutrality, from a pure neutrality between the two. And I think what Putin is looking for is not neutrality in a Swiss sense, but he wants more of a protectorate in Ukraine, where he has a veto over the policies of Ukraine. So this is far more consequential, something like what Pandit Nehru signed with Bhutan, probably, and not a simple declaration of neutrality. For Ukraine, while it's ready for neutrality, it wants security guarantees. And those security guarantees, it cannot take the Russian security guarantees. It wants Western security guarantees. And that's already going to take you back to the original problem of the nature of Ukraine's security relationship with Russia and the West. So this is going to be very tricky, and the positions of both sides will keep changing depending on the military situation on the ground. Even today, this morning, I mean, Ukrainians refused to cede Mariupol despite the ultimatum. And my sense is this is, as I said, there is no near-term diplomatic solutions for this, at least from my perspective. Third, the internal contradictions. We've heard some speculation in Russia, in the public. You saw Putin mobilize 80,000 people in a massive rally. At least some opinion polls say he has 70% support. There is an swelling of Russian nationalism, and it is rallying behind the flag and behind Mr. Putin. But there are other reports that there are internally, the failed military campaign is generated some fissures between the FSB, the External Intelligence Agency, and the armed forces. In a typical situation like this, you're always going to find scapegoats. Probably that will go on. But at this point, perhaps it's reasonable to assume these internal contradictions are not going to fundamentally weaken Putin's position, at least in the near term. On the Ukrainian side, yesterday, Ukraine banned some political parties because this idea, it's nice to think of Ukrainians as united, but like in any society, there are divisions. And as Russia gains control of territory, it co-opts some sections. There are going to be problems, and it will be quite hard for Ukrainians to sustain this coalition. That we know that in any war, in any major confrontation, maintaining internal coalition united is always going to be a problem. And I think we are seeing some of those problems beginning to unfold on both sides. But he who can hold his flanks secure will be in a better position at the end of it. Right now, we can't be sure. Third, on the external coalitions, at this point, the main thing, I'm sure Ambassador Shyam Saran is going to talk about it, the Russian coalition with China. There are multiple questions raised. I mean, what led to it? What does the way this campaign has gone? Is China changing its mind? Americans have been reaching out to them, whether to warn them or to open a door. We don't know clearly. But the fact is, any set of interpretations can be given to the stability of the Russian coalition with China. Are Chinese quite happy to let the Russians fight with the West, and that gives them a reprieve? Are the Chinese making an adjustment to the West, seeing the kind of scale of the economic sanctions, or are the Russians fully committed to China, or are they simply, navigating in between a rhetorical support for Russia while keeping the door open for engagement with China? So you can pick up any one of these options, but I'll leave it to Ambassador Saran to expand on where this is going. On the Western side, but before we go to the Western side, Ukrainian side, whatever happens, Ambassador Saran has written about this. At the end of this war, Russia will be weaker, far weaker vis-a-vis China. That seems to be a reasonable prediction that you can make. Russia will be weakened by this war, and that it will need China a lot more than China will need Russia. And what that means is something we can debate. On the Western side, thanks to Putin, I think there has been a clear consolidation, re-emergence of NATO. NATO, which was floundering, President Macron of France had called it brain dead just a year or two ago. Now it seems revitalized and ready to, and if they lose Ukraine after fighting till the last Ukrainian, to prevent further aggression is going to be the urgent priority, and NATO is going to get stronger. We're going to see President Biden travel to Europe this week, to European Council meeting, as well as the NATO meeting. We're going to see NATO come out stronger from this. One of the interesting outcomes from this is the Americans have successfully used this crisis to discipline the Europeans. Our dear French friends talk about strategic autonomy, but Europe cannot defend itself against Russia, partly when Russia is on the offensive. Therefore, they will have to turn to the Americans for protection, and the Americans are going to take a full advantage of it. We've already seen German rearmament. They've announced $100 billion defense spending this year. The first bite at that new $100 billion has gone to Lockheed Martin, which is going to sell F-35s to Germany. The idea of a European fighter aircraft will now go for a 6. So I think in the end, the European dependence on the United States will be stronger, and the American ability to set the broader terms for Europe, I think, will significantly increase. In that sense, you could argue the Americans come out on top of the heap in this triangular power hierarchy between US, Russia, and China. Then let me conclude by just looking at the implications for India. India is between a rock and a hard place, as the Americans might say. Whatever the outcome, it's not going to be, unless this quickly finishes, which will be our expectation. I don't see any benefits from this crisis at all for India, because India has no control over what Russia does. I mean, all this talk about mediation is fine, but India cannot determine the calculations of Putin, nor can it influence the outcomes on the other side. So the challenge for India in the near term is to manage the path dependence on Russia for weapons. Therefore, but if you start something now to strengthen your military self-reliance, maybe that will happen over a period of time. But in the near term, we are stuck with Russia, and the Russian dependence on the Russian weapons, which we have allowed to fester for the last 30 years, has severely complicated India's room for maneuver. But that doesn't mean we don't have any room for maneuver. We are not the only ones in trouble. The Germans are in trouble, and a whole lot of others. So I think there's some room to maneuver. And I think so far, so good. My sense is India's principal objective will be to protect the Indo-Pacific elements of cooperation with the US from being consumed by the loss of support and some disenchantment with India in the West. But then that's par for the course. But my sense is within the bad situation, there is sufficient room for India to manage the situation. Ambassador Kumar, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Raja Mohan. You have covered so many aspects. Now I will turn to Suhasini Haidar. This is one of those conflicts where there's tough competition among the Indian television channels. We have seen so many channels have sent the crew there down in conflict zone. Gaurav Sawant and your colleague is not the only, Mohan is not the only persons who are there. Every channel has that. How the coverage of this war has gone so far, I personally feel Zelensky, with all the problems, has really won the media war. I mean, look at his coverage, I mean, his emotionally charged, inspiring speeches. He addresses the US Congress, he addresses the British Parliament, he addresses so many world leaders, and he's out there, I mean, advertising his own brand of new presidency, galvanizing the country. You have seen his attire, he's totally different than anybody else. He looks president, he's a trench, he's in hospital, he's everywhere. How have India and China have been perceived in the media? Because we both abstain, but our different reasons. And Professor Raja has already said we have very less maneuvering, and China has its own reasons. But how do you see the handling of this conflict by USA and European leaders?
Thank you so much, and thank you for including me in such a distinguished panel, Ambassador Surendra Kumar. I'll come to that question that you asked, is how has President Zelensky really played this? Clearly from day one, President Zelensky, with, one would say, the benefit of having the entire Western media, which is what most of the English-speaking world has access to internationally, much more than others. Have in fact played a he has been able to play a very a tragic figure, but a tragic heroic figure in many ways. And I think you're right that in India there is some amount of sympathy. We're seeing the pictures of what is happening in Ukraine. We're also seeing a certain amount of admiration For example, when the Ukrainian ambassador put out President Zelensky's appeal for fighters to sign up, we actually saw an Indian already taking part over there, although I think now he has decided to return home, and about 500 others signing up with the embassy that, we would also like to go and fight, obviously not being allowed to from here. But I'm sad to say, and I presume it is only realism, that the Indian media's real interest in the war in Ukraine, in terms of what you were describing, in terms of television and in terms of actually covering what is happening in the war, has on the ground been limited to covering the fate of Indian citizens and Indian students. And therefore, as Operation Ganga has ended and 20,000 Indians have returned, what we have also seen is a certain waning of that kind of interest. And in fact, all the journalists have now returned home. I think that says a lot. That says a lot about the kind of public interest there is in this war. European officials have been constantly saying that this is not a European war. This is a war that affects everybody around the world. But it is possible in the Indian context to see many sides of it. I think it is also helped by the fact that in India, we have the strongest media narrative creation is done by the government itself. So if you were to follow what the government of the day, the Modi government, has decided to do vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia, you will find that there is the narrative has matched that. The media narrative has more or less, and columns, in fact, have all been praise of the Indian government's stand on this. And I will come to that in just a second. But I do want to make the second point, that on the one hand, President Zelensky has been presented as this very heroic, tragic figure. He's fighting till the last. Unfair comparisons, if you like, have been made to President Ghani, who left the country rather than face the Taliban, whereas, there he is every day meeting wounded soldiers, meeting students, meeting kids in hospitals and all the rest of that. But in India, and I think amongst the commentariat, we've already seen many questions being asked about why NATO continued to push ahead with its eastern expansion, and also had put Ukraine on this wait list in 2008, why it continued with the rhetoric until, in fact, December last year, after President Biden met President Zelensky, the idea that, yes, NATO might be on the cards. Today, they might all say, no, we were never going towards the Ukraine in any case, but the fact was the narrative was all there. There are many who do have some sympathy for the idea that there was in fact enough signals from Russia and President Putin, including an article he wrote last July, putting out the case and saying that this far and no further as far as we are concerned. And I do think that there are enough questions being asked. In fact, we saw it in Parliament when the External Affairs Minister stood up to defend his government's policy. He actually more or less criticized the Ukrainian government and said they have been sending mixed signals from the beginning. And they had, in fact, said, to begin with, there's nothing happening at our borders that hasn't happened in the past. Then they went on to say, no, you must not spread panic. And this was one of the reasons why students stayed back, of course, deflecting some of the blame from the Indian government's own very vague advisories that were sent out at the beginning on February 15, saying those who don't need to stay in Ukraine may consider leaving at this point. So I do think that there is sympathy in India. While there is a media narrative out there, I think there is sympathy in India for perhaps both sides. And then there will be those who at least see themselves as realists who will say, well, if President Zelensky was willing to go this far with NATO, with the European Union, and now he has a membership application given to the European Union, then surely he should have known that he was going to, quote unquote, poke the bear, and therefore should have firmed up what kind of response he would have received from NATO and the EU before actually going forward with this. So there, the media coverage, while it has played out in India, there has been a certain balance to it. And as I said, I think because the government is taken the stand it has taken, a lot of the media and commentariat have found it more convenient, perhaps, not to question it too much. And there is also always a consensus in foreign policy. I think Mr. Jaishankar said when he went to the Parliamentary Standing Committee that he had received no real pushback from the opposition. Even I know that Mr. Tharoor has written and spoken very strongly on a different note, but it is a different note from his own party at present. And just to sum up the media kind of coverage, I would say that the Western media and the Russian media have in fact just played out the Noam Chomsky manufactured consent idea. We are seeing in the West a kind of one-sided portrayal of this entire conflict, a one-sided villainization, if you like. Even if you do not approve of anything that the Russian president has done, the idea that the West now can only see this one version of his actions, and consequently, we have seen on the Russian side, the banning of other channels, the shutting down of opposition-friendly channels inside Russia. So even internally, there's a kind of clamp down. And in the West, for the first time, we're seeing this so-called Western liberal order that talks about freedom of expression, shutting down television channels, blocking out signals, even to the point that we've heard these, anecdotal things on an Italian university stopping teaching Dostoevsky, or the Munich Philharmonic Orchestra insisting that its conductor actually denounce Russia or quit. Similar stories in New York, in Montreal. So, like the hub and heart of the Western liberal order has found itself not so liberal when it comes to trying to, isolate Russia, as it were. And also the widespread support for sanctions in the world. These unilateral sanctions. If you were to ask the world, where have sanctions actually worked? Perhaps many would say South Africa. Those were global sanctions. There was a United Nations component to it. Today, you're looking at unilateral sanctions of a completely different order coming from the Western world, and complete support for it on that side, whether it is cutting Russia out of SWIFT, whether it is cutting out Russian oil exports of any kind, also banning of all banks, sanctions on individuals, sanctions on Russian businesses, really ensuring, and we are seeing the kind of drumbeat that goes along with it coming from the West. So even if NATO has said we will not put our boots on the ground in Ukraine, this economic war that they have declared on Russia has full support over there. Where is the impact going to be? I'll go very quickly. I know I don't have much time. 5 points, I'll say. One, Ukraine is much more united than perhaps it has ever been. A sense of the Ukraine nationhood is coming together, where even Russian-speaking areas are a part of the fight back. The second, NATO is increasing its defense budget. This is going to have long-term effects, where countries are going from 2% to 4% of their GDPs. What seems clear is that even if Mr. Putin were to end the war today, a Rubicon has been crossed with the West. And I don't think that there is going to be a point of return to, the past at any time now, given the kind of ways in which the world has decoupled itself from Russia and from Mr. Putin in particular. I think you'll see the impact very quickly on multilateral meetings. For example, Indonesia is to host the G20 this year. We'll see whether everybody is willing to come and who will be left out of that. That the Western sanctions are going to lead to a more rapid deglobalization. COVID already made the shift to regionalization economically, and this is going to mean a more rapid deglobalization. We may see the emergence if countries like India, China, parts of Africa, other parts of the global South continue to deal with Russia and continue to find ways around the Western sanctions, as India has been doing. We might see the emergence of two worlds, the dollar and the non-dollar transaction world, with different worldviews completely. And I think the final impact is on the UN, which has been completely cast aside. It doesn't matter how many resolutions they have passed or spoken about. Even Mr. Putin's own announcement of his war right in the middle of a UN Security Council meeting really shows exactly how much the UN and the UN Security Council right now count for either side, because the sanctions that responded to Mr. Putin are equally unilateral. Nobody's trying to bring them through. It does seem like an opportunity for India to try and get some reworking of this veto system and the reform for the UN Security Council, but that is, of course, a very, very long way away. And finally, and I know that some will disagree with me on this, India's own reasons for its position seem to be becoming more and more, if you like, articulated. And we have seen in the last few years and last few days, the government reaching out with its point of view of what it is trying to do. So if India's position is that it will continue to abstain at the UN and other multilateral organizations, that it will continue its defense partnership with Russia, including bringing in parts from Russia, including, of course, India's foremost export, military export of the BrahMos. That is also something India can't do without its collaboration with Russia. And it is now going to step up its purchase of oil. If that is the case, we do have to look at just where the Indian government is. Many have sort of said, well, it's taken the Modi government 8 years to walk back to non-alignment. But I think there are deeper reasons that have to be looked at. There is a comfort level that we are seeing the government has in this particular position, in a position where it does not take on Russia. And this has nothing to do, the hesitation of history and all the rest of that, the United States. This is not going away.
Thank you. Comfort level. Okay, to have some idea of comfort level, I move to our friend Shyam. Shyam, you have seen President Biden has been doing all the flurry of video conferences and talking to so many. Then he had 2-hour marathon video talk with Xi Jinping. He has been talking to the European leaders. We have seen Macron going to Moscow so many times, sitting on the long 40 feet long table other end with Putin, and Turkish president doing, but all these things don't seem to be really working. How do you see an end to this conflict soon? Economic sanctions will certainly cripple Russian economy, but it's not going to happen a day or week. It will take months, and by the time if this kind of bombardment, this kind of supersonic missiles are being used, there's very little of equipment will be left. So I don't know, how do you see this is really playing out in coming weeks? And then what are the repercussions for us? Yes, we have given our reasons. We can certainly buy oil. If Europeans are buying oil, yes, why can't we buy it? But in the long run, do you see whatever we have built relationship with the US during 3 presidents, George Bush, then you have Obama, then you have Trump, now we have Biden, is going to be affected in some way, or they will understand our reasoning for what action we are taking? And try to enlighten us. Even I was reading this morning, some foreign policy magazine said Putin's war is a death blow to the nuclear proliferation in the world, because Ukraine must be regretting what they have done in 1994. Well, they had more nuclear weapons than China, France, and the UK put together. And if they had some today, they might have been treated differently. Over to you, Shyam.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Surinder. I think much of what needed to be said analyzing this situation has already been said, so I don't know how much more I can contribute. Let me say that, the basis on which the war can end, certainly the Russians have put out what their minimal demands are. I think 1 or 2 of those demands have been conceded, which is that Ukraine should accept a neutral status, and that should be enshrined in its constitution, that it will not join NATO. That also has been conceded. I think the sticking points are the status of Crimea and the status of the 2 republics, independent republics, which have been established in the Donbas area. By the way, in the Donbas area, it is not that the entire area of the 2 republics is actually under the control of the separatists. It is only a fraction of that territory which is under control. The rest of the area is still under the control of Ukraine. From what I read, I see that there has been a recommendation that we agree on the main issue, that is neutrality and not joining NATO, but that you somehow ring fence these outstanding issues on Crimea and on Donbas, that perhaps this may be taken up at a later stage, because I cannot see how Ukraine it would be able to agree to surrendering both Crimea and Donbass, and probably there will be also advice from US and the Western countries that they should not compromise on this issue of territorial integrity and sovereignty. So I think there is this remaining issue that is standing in the way, and I think the Russian calculation is that by escalating the level of violence, and as you can see that over the last few days there has been a major escalation in the level of violence, that perhaps this might lead Ukraine to finally agree to Russian terms. So far, that doesn't seem to be likely. So that is where we are. In a sense, it is in a bit of an impasse, militarily speaking. Today, the European Union is also meeting in Brussels, and I understand that there is another set of about 5 or 6 new sanctions which are going to be put on Russia, which will mean that the deplugging from the global economy will go even further than it already has. But we should note the fact, and we should point this out. There is a level of hypocrisy in the Western stand, because despite this war, the flow of gas through Ukraine to Germany is still flowing. There has been no interruption to that, and there has also been a carve out on the financial sanctions to enable Germany to be able to pay for the gas that it is getting from Russia. So where their own interests are, what they consider vital interests are involved, they are ready to make these kind of compromises, while of course making a lot of song and dance about what other countries may be doing. So I think there is need to also be conscious of this kind of double standard which we see. The interesting thing for me is what I have been looking at, and perhaps this is something which we may perhaps look at a little more closely as the days go by. There is a interesting asymmetry in the American stand. The Americans right from the beginning said they will, of course, oppose Russia, impose sanctions, but they will not put boots on the ground in Ukraine. They will not risk any kind of direct confrontation with Russia. And thirdly, when the specific issue of the transfer of MiG aircraft to Ukraine from Poland was mooted, earlier there seemed to be some encouragement from the American side, but later, in fact, the Americans came down very, very strongly and swiftly, saying that no, they will not allow this to happen because of that aversion to risk. So there is this kind of position that they have taken, where the red lines are very clearly drawn in terms of what would be the extent of American support for Ukraine. If you look at the Indo-Pacific, you see a different situation. Because while here on the Ukraine side, the issue of territorial integrity and sovereignty is very, very clear. There has been a violation of territorial integrity and sovereignty. On the Indo-Pacific side, if you take the Taiwan issue, in a sense, the question of territorial integrity and sovereignty, at least theoretically, is not such a big issue, because Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan internationally has more or less been conceded. It's not a different country in that sense, legally speaking. And if you recall, the Chinese, in fact, took the position when people were trying to show a parallel between what is happening in Ukraine and what is happening on the Taiwan issue. They were very, very quick in saying that there is no parallel between the two, that this is a question of sovereignty on the one side, and here is a question of China actually being able to assert its sovereignty on a province which it belongs to China. So they said that there was no parallel. Now here, the US, unlike in the case of Ukraine, has a policy of strategic ambiguity. That means it is not clear that if China does something, the United States of America will not put boots on the ground or will not send the 7th Fleet to attack the invading Chinese forces. That has been left as a question mark. The more interesting thing to me is that just yesterday, having taken the position that there is no parallel between the two theaters, the Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Liu Chen comes up and says, oh, actually, there is a parallel. That, just as the Ukrainian crisis was triggered by NATO expansion towards the east, maybe we will have the similar kind of situation if there is an expansion of the Quad, into the Indo-Pacific or Asia Pacific, as he says. That there is actually a parallel, and therefore, the Quad countries should be very, very careful about what they are doing. So it's interesting to see some of this twist and turn in the discourse on both sides. And I think this reflects the fact that no one is quite certain where this is going. So everyone is trying desperately to keep ahead of the curve, but the situation is changing so rapidly. It is also interesting to me that in the midst of all this, the Chinese have, if the reports are correct, that the Chinese foreign minister would like to come to India. I believe he's visiting also Nepal and Pakistan. And that they would like to make a serious effort to improve relations between India and China. That is, of course, perhaps related to the forthcoming BRICS summit or the RIC summit, which optically to me would help China, because it would seem as if China is not actually so much isolated on the issue of its relations with Russia. There are other major countries who are also, very mindful of the importance of the relations with Russia. But I do believe that this will not really make a big difference in terms of the basic adversarial character of the relationship which prevails at this point of time with China. But if tactically there is some benefit to be had by India, I see no reason why we should not try to get something out of it. Now, can India sustain this kind of a very delicate balancing act that it has been doing? I think that's the issue. Two things. One, if I look at it in a somewhat longer term context, it is very clear that whatever may be the tactical advantage which United States of America has been able to get as a result of this crisis, and there is no doubt that the United States of America has in fact been a gainer in net terms, it is a gainer from this. If you are looking at the trajectory of the China on one hand and the US on the other, that trajectory is not changing. That is, the relative equation of power between China and the United States of America, that trajectory will continue, which means that the asymmetry between China and the US is still going to keep on shrinking. So going forward, even if there is this tactical advantage, the overall prospect is for, in relative terms, China becoming a more powerful country than it is today, of course, other things being equal. If that is the case, then I believe that the interest of the United States, as well as the other Quad partners, in maintaining a strong partnership with India will remain. And I see this, for example, in the latest summit meeting, the virtual summit meeting, which took place between Australia and India, between Mr. Modi and Prime Minister Morrison, because that while there was an expression of strong, condemnation of the Russians, they were very, very careful in not, attacking India or even implicitly attacking, criticizing India, and expressing a very strong interest in an even stronger partnership between India and the Quad countries. So that leads me to think that given the overall trajectory that we are looking at, the interest of the United States and the other Quad partners in a strong partnership with India, which continues to be in an adversarial relationship with China, irrespective of what happens with Russia, irrespective of what happens with the United States, I think that is a strong assurance that this part of the equation is probably going to endure. That is my assumption. So while our balancing act may become a little more difficult as time goes on, I do not think that we are in serious danger of sort of falling off the cliff, as it were. Lastly, I would also like to make the point that in terms of the relationship with Russia, the overall trajectory of India's relations with Russia has also been declining. So whatever may be the compulsions that we may have at the moment, if you look at the last, especially since the end of the Cold War, actually the relationship has been in a steady decline. The only part which has perhaps remained important is the defense part, no doubt about it. But today I was looking at the figures given in the Business Standard on India's dependence on foreign military imports. Actually, the dependence on Russia is not 70% or 80% as has been bandied about, but according to the figures given there, it's about 45 or 46%. So actually it's much lower than what it was before. Now, will that change in a hurry? It will not change in a hurry. But I think we can very credibly point to our other partners that this has been the long-term trend as far as India's relations with Russia is concerned. India-Russia relations are not the old India-Soviet Union relations. Russia is not Soviet Union. So and even in terms of the geopolitical aspect, the fact is that on some key issues, there has been a divergence. If you take the Afghan issue, 10 years ago, India and Russia may have been on the same page. 10 years later, we are not on the same page. So I think we should also be mindful of the fact that we are actually in the midst of a steadily declining profile of India-Russia relations, even though those relations continue to be important. And I think that's an important aspect to keep in mind and to point this out to others as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Shyam. You have covered long distance. Now I turn to my friend Shashi. First of all, thank you, Shashi, for coming out of Parliament to really support us. We have been a great supporter of IAFA for the last 12 years. I appreciate your help. You have heard everybody, and you can comment on their comment and add your own. But I want to draw attention to some comment from one of your very close friends. I read an article from our former governor of Reserve Bank, Dr. Raghuram Raman, and he said, if Russian President Vladimir Putin's aggression were to go unpunished, more international provocations like this war in Ukraine would become inevitable. Equally problematic is the breakdown of the international order. The United States Security Council cannot legitimately act against any of its permanent veto-wielding members. The organization's impotence translates into impunity for strongmen to flout international norms. Economic weapons made possible by global integration offer a way to bypass a paralyzed global governance system. They allow other powers an effective but civilized way to respond to aggression and barbarity. But the risk that these weapons can create must not be underplayed. When fully unleashed, sanctions too are weapons of mass destruction. Like the military weapons of mass destruction, the sanctions inflict pain indiscriminately, striking both the culpable and innocent. And if they are used too widely, they could reverse the process of globalization that has allowed the modern world to prosper. So besides commenting all those things, you might also touch on this. Thank you. Your audio is, I think you have to unmute. Yeah.
My apologies. I didn't mute myself, you did. But anyway, thank you. Good to be with you. I was just saying, in fact, that I intended to address the question of global governance in the 3 or 4 points that I would like to make. Let me first of all congratulate you on convening this meeting and really express my admiration for the very rich, well-informed, insightful comments we've already heard from the earlier speakers. As I said, I just have really 3 major points to put before you all. The first is, of course, has already been alluded to by Suhasini, which is my concern about our initial reaction to what happened. I must say that abstention, many of us were troubled by, but abstention itself was not the problem. It was a rather mealy-mouthed explanation of vote that we gave at the very beginning, which must have come presumably with instructions, referring to quote-unquote matter of deep concern, refusal to name Russia, refusal to consider Russia as a wrongdoer. And I understood very much that that we had an imperative to put our friendship with Russia up sort of front and center. But if friends can't speak honestly to each other, what's a friendship worth? We have essentially found ourselves countenancing an action by Russia that violated a number of very crucial principles that we ourselves have stood for 70 odd years. The inviolability of borders, the sacrosanct nature of state sovereignty, the inadmissibility of the use of force when it comes to resolving international disputes. And since all of this basically occurred in the Russian action, don't forget, it's only been 8 months since Biden and Putin even met cordially in Geneva in June. It was a clearly sort of an escalation coming entirely from one side, and yet we have sought to give a curious even-handedness in our language. We sought de-escalation as if both countries were belligerents, when one was clearly the aggressor and the other its victim. We did not even object to Russia's recognition of the so-called independence of 2 separatist Ukrainian regions. Imagine if a neighbor did that to a separatist part of our country. And for us to talk about the need for honest and sincere dialogue, where it's only one side that clearly has resorted to military action, the entire thing left a bad taste in our mouth. And I think that those who said that our initial explanation of vote in the UN placed us on the wrong side of history, I think were totally right. I think we subsequently rectified, and as we look across our 6 abstentions, it became very clear that we were increasingly hardening our language, recalling these principles, while at the same time continuing to abstain in order to convey to the Russians that we were not condemning them. At the same time, some of the reasons adduced in the analyses in India, I find slightly, I must say, unconvincing. For example, the question of our heavy dependence on Russia for military supplies. Yes, we purchase an awful lot of our weaponry and defense equipment from them, but we paid top dollar, top rupee for them. So the Soviet Union, I beg your pardon, the Russian Federation needs us as a market as much as we need them as a supplier. It's mutual dependence, it's not one-sided. Secondly, the sanctions have crippled Russia's ability to continue supplying or manufacturing such weapon systems and spare parts. For example, they don't have a domestic semiconductor industry. They were importing the semiconductors required in the fabrication of many of these weapons, and essentially all semiconductor exports to Russia have been frozen under these sanctions. That's one simple example. There are other bits of parts that go into these things where Russia is not as Atmanirbhar as we have imagined. And I think we're going to have some real problems in being able to maintain this kind of supply system, supply chain from Russia. Now, having said all of this, I know the sacred principles of international law don't always apply to everyone else, but I would say that if China marches across the LAC to teach India a lesson in the same way, we will have no one else to blame if our pleas for the world support fall on deaf ears. Even if the Chinese can credibly argue that doing it to Taiwan is, from their point of view, not a violation of sovereignty, it still is the inadmissibility of the use of force. So that some of these principles are worth asserting, it seems to me, even for us. So that's one broad set of concerns that I have. And I do believe that India's failure to go along with the other three could have weakened the Quad. We seem to have scrambled fairly effectively to square up with the other Quad members. And though we have not joined the sanctions, all three of them have, thank God. But the fact still is that that we do seem to have done some deft diplomacy to prevent that relationship going south. So there we're okay. But we needed at the same time to be as friendly as possible with Ukraine and its very anti-Russian neighbors to facilitate the evacuation of our students. So we did need the kind of recalibration that we conducted in the end. Now, that's on the first broad set of issues. The second set of issues that I had relate to the broader strategic vulnerabilities we have in a tough neighborhood. Because the truth is that if we were to look frankly at everything that has happened, I mentioned the question of the dependence on Russia militarily, but we are dancing on a tightrope by in many ways, let's put it bluntly, undermining our strategic partnership with the US and the significance of our increasing closeness in terms of defense ties by our distance from the US and from the Quad, which otherwise is a very useful counter to China for us. We know that till the Ukraine crisis began to rumble a few months ago, the US itself seemed to be more focused on the global threat from China, and the Indo-Pacific had loomed larger in Washington's concerns in Europe. Clearly, that's game over. I mean, Washington will once again focus on Europe. It already is, and it'll revive its adversarial obsession with Russia. Might it not, in the process, de-emphasize its hostility to China? This is a country that has killed 20 Indian soldiers in an unprovoked attack less than 2 years ago. Could we be facing a situation in which the US is much more detached from our immediate geostrategic concerns in our backyard, in our continent at any rate, while focusing much more on Europe and Russia, which in any case has been historically been a US priority, but has only been recently de-emphasized. To add to this, it seems to me Russia's growing closeness to China, its growing geopolitical affinity, and as Raja Mohan pointed out, I think it's certainly weakened in its relationship with China. It will need China more than China will need it. And this has been happening at a time when we have always felt that we could keep an independent relationship with Russia vis-a-vis China. On top of that, we have the visible warming of Moscow to Pakistan, China's client state on our borders. And of course, it was striking that not only was Imran Khan in Moscow on the day the Ukraine invasion began, but that he continued with his meetings, including with President Putin, rather than walking out in disapproval. Many of you, Shyam, Saran, will remember Vajpayee canceling his visit to China and flying back in protest to India the day the Chinese attacked Vietnam while he was on Chinese soil. Imran could have done that. He could have canceled his meetings and gone back to Pakistan. But he stayed on and he conducted meetings and even talked about what an exciting time it was to be in Russia. It certainly suggests that the Russia to Pakistan equation is shifting, and I think that has implications for us that we cannot ignore. And to my mind, these worries, compounded by the fact that Russia, China, and Iran recently conducted joint naval exercises in the Indian Ocean, I definitely worry that the scales appear to be tilting in ways that do not augur well for our choices and our security in our own subcontinent, in our own neighborhood. And so this deeply uncomfortable position at a time when we are also at the same time playing footsie with Russia on Ukraine has, I think, in some ways given us the worst of all worlds. And there are fundamental questions about our grand strategy if the world slips seemingly inexorably into two mutually hostile camps, Russia going into the Chinese embrace, Pakistan cozying up with them, and Europe, America, the West consolidating in hostility to Russia and thereby to the others. It seems to me non-alignment will not be an easy option when we have antagonists camped on our borders seeking to violate our borders. So our familiar reluctance to choose sides on any major international question could still come back to haunt us. That's the second big issue. And third, I'll be brief because I think my time is almost up, is on the global governance aspect. I think obviously the limitations of the United Nations have been grossly shown up for all the reasons that have been mentioned. I kept asking myself what the UN Secretary General, who's a very able former Portuguese PM, was doing during all the weeks that the Americans were crying themselves hoarse about an imminent invasion for weeks before it actually happened. Could he have tried to use his good offices to resolve the crisis? Did he send an emissary to Moscow to find out its intentions and understand what its irreducible demands were? Then have the same person go to Kiev to get Ukraine to agree to the terms of a compromise. Of course, these efforts don't have to be public, but there's no evidence anywhere of any shuttle diplomacy conducted along these lines, and certainly not to NATO or Brussels or Washington either. And if you compare it with, say, Utant's intervention between Moscow and Washington during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he sent telegrams to both sides and tried to find common ground, Guterres' silence does surprise me. It's been Naftali Bennett, the Premier of Israel, who did travel to Moscow and apparently reportedly proposed a 15-point peace plan to his interlocutors there. So where is the global system? Are we going to say that if the Security Council is paralyzed by the fact that one permanent member is the principal actor in a violation of the peace, does that mean that the Secretary General also sits on his hands? I don't think it was necessary to do that. Kofi Annan showed us when the Americans were about to bomb Baghdad, he took the initiative without consulting the Americans to travel to Baghdad and try and defuse the bombing. And he bought, in effect, 6 to 9 months of peace for the Iraqis at that time, before the Americans lost patience and bombed Saddam after all. But at least, that kind of initiative the Secretary General has the ability to take. And I'm sorry to say I don't see any evidence that that our friend Mr. Guterres has done that. And that worries me, because I think the UN's continuing relevance as an institution to make peace as well as maintain it, and not just to keep it in conditions where all the permanent members don't object to their peacekeeping. That has been given a very, very serious blow by the Ukraine crisis, and it does raise very serious questions about the long-term credibility and viability of the global governance institutions at the UN heads. I'll stop there. I think I've taken my 10 minutes. Thank you, Saran.
Thank you, Shashi. You have introduced element of realism and also candor. Just one question before I ask others. Imran Khan had very loudly, openly complimented India for independent foreign policy. Is a left-hand compliment who really means it?
No, I think he means it. He's a peculiar chap. I think he really does mean it, because he was saying in that mass rally that he addressed to address his political crisis, he actually said to the public, the Europeans had the guts to tell me that I should support Ukraine. Will they have the guts to write a letter like this to India? Now that's an public speech in a mass rally. So Imran actually believes that India has shown a little more gumption than Pakistan historically would, and he wants to emulate that. So I think to that degree we should be very happy that that Imran, who has been inveighing against us on various bits of rhetoric on this issue, has recognized our robust independence. Now the point is, that's all very good, and it goes back to Nehru and his willingness to punch above his weight as an independent voice in world affairs. But we also have to make some realistic calculations beyond that independent voice, because as we know, our independent stature in the world throughout the 50s did not help us very much when it came to 62. So I don't want us to see another 62 situation in our country.
Okay, now we are delighted to see, as usual, the senior-most diplomat on the audience side. I have Ambassador Eric Gonsalves there. Sir, you have been listening patiently, and you have been eyewitness and also active participant in many of the events and decisions. Would you like to make any comment or ask any question?
No, I've listened to all of this with great interest because I think that we are ourselves in such a difficult position that we are squeaking around to find a way by which we can stand by our principles and also look after our interests, which actually in diplomacy is always a problem. And but I do think that in this we are overplaying a little bit of the dependence on Russia than is meaningful. And equally, I think we're also overplaying the willingness of the Americans to play ball with us, which depends really on what we do, not on what the Americans do. So I think that we should be, in fact, taking leaf out of what Shashi's just been saying, that we should be seeing whether we can do some diplomacy to sort out problems like Ukraine, rather than wait for the United Nations. Or otherwise, I mean, this was what Nehru did all the time. This is what happened right through the last, almost last couple of decades of our foreign policy. We were busy. Krishna Menon did this, Krishna Menon did Korea, Krishna Menon did Indochina, Krishna Menon was in Cyprus, we were doing all sorts of things. And we were achieving things. The Korean ceasefire without us would not have happened. And I was there when we did it. So I think that we have shrunk our position to a point where we don't stick our necks out when it's a matter of principle, and where we can use it. I don't know whether we can, because frankly, that the independence we had is atrophied. And therefore our stature, although you might say that, we were all called names on the streets of New York in the 50s, commies and this, that, and the other, but people listened to us. So I don't know quite how we make our mark and our strategic autonomy or non-alignment or whatever you want to call it. But we haven't cultivated our position because we don't actually take trouble about other countries. We've lost the Southeast Asians. We've done quite well in the Gulf for one, but we are a bit lost in Europe today, and so on and so on. So, we've got to constantly keep up relationships. These things don't happen automatically. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, sir. 2 days back, delivering the C.D. Deshmukh Memorial Lecture, Ambassador Sugotra, who is 2 or 3 years ahead of you, he openly said that time has come, we must come much, much closer to USA. We must revisit our relationship with Russia, because this is largely defense in oil and gas and nothing more. Now, before, is there anybody else? Raja, you wanted to go. Before you go, you want to make any comment? Professor Raja Mohan.
No, just one brief point. I would say, look, we must recognize that this is the first major great power conflict since the Second World War. So this is not just another crisis that we are dealing with, but this is really a major confrontation between the great powers. The fighting is still indirect, but the fact is it has the potential to escalate. This in turn means that these challenges that it presents are not going to be solved by, the debates, our internal debates, which are far too focused on double standards, hypocrisies, who's right, who started it, who's responsible, to one where actually in a major war like this, outcomes have effects on everyone else. Therefore, I think our principal objective in this is to make sure that we don't read this wrong, and that whatever happens, our interests are protected, rather than trying to be either moralistic or trying to make a difference on the ground at this point of time. Second, I think in wars and love, there is no rules. Everything goes. So my sense is that while we talk about the rules-based order, the principles, the real stuff is that every side, all of them are going to play dirty, and therefore we should ought to be prepared for those outcomes as well. So I'll just conclude by saying that, look, we have, and I'll agree with Ambassador Shyam, and that we still have room to play, and that the US still needs India to deal with the question of balance of power in Asia. Just because Russia is a problem in Europe does not mean Asian security issues are going to disappear. And more importantly, if the Russia-China alliance deepens in the coming years, in fact, the need for India for the West will only increase. So therefore, I think if we play this right, I think we can still come out fairly successfully from this. So I'll stop here, Ambassador.
Thank you, Professor. Now you're free to leave if you want to. Otherwise, you're welcome to stay on.
No, thank you very much.
Among the audience, I see Professor Chintamani Mahapatra. That there has been so much mention of USA. Professor Mahapatra, what do you think? How has President Biden been doing so far?
Thank you, sir. Thank you for this opportunity. I listened very carefully to all the presentations, learned a great deal. But I would say that like India, like China, like many other countries, even the United States has its own dilemma, own problems, own differences. There is no absolute unity between the Republicans and the Democrats on this issue. As time passes by, the differences will increase. In November, there is going to be congressional election in the United States. And you can see how Donald Trump says that it is better to send troops to the Mexican border than to Poland. And you are sending troops to Poland not to fight with Russians. So it's better to send troops to Texas. So these differences are going on. As far as the president, Joe Biden is concerned, he has his own dilemma. The way he is following the policy, on the one hand, he is not fully committed to support Ukraine and confront the Russians. His goal is not to escalate to a situation where there will be direct confrontation between the two. And at the same time, try to help Ukraine as much as possible. But whatever help is coming from the US by waging an economic war with Russia, pumping in some weapons to Ukraine, are these the adequate methods to really trouble the Russians? I don't think so. There are some people who think that what Biden administration is trying to do is to get Russia entangled in Ukraine for a longer time, let there be an insurgency, and the kind of weapons that are being pumped into Ukraine will actually help Ukraine in fighting the insurgency, rather than this asymmetrical warfare with Russia. If that happens, then of course it is going to be a long drawn out affair. This is not the first time it is happening like this. We saw this in Korea for 3 years. We saw this in Vietnam for 15 years. We saw this in Afghanistan for 10 years when the Soviets were involved there and the Americans were supporting from outside. This is what their goal is. But we should not undermine the intelligence of Putin. I think Putin has thought about it very clearly before moving in. I entirely agree with Suhasini ji, the way she talked about the propaganda war. This is not just the land warfare, the aerial warfare, or the economic warfare. The propaganda war is going on, and who is winning, who is losing, we don't know. Whatever analysis we are doing right now, we do not have our own information to either verify or to have or to generate our own information. So I think we should not undermine the intelligence of Putin. He must have thought through. It was since April 2021 that he had been putting troops along the Ukrainian border. He had warned the Americans many, many times. William Burns, the CIA director, in last several years, 3 times he openly warned, don't push the Russians to a point like extending NATO up to their doorstep. It will be disastrous. And that disaster has taken place. How it is going to unfold, we don't know. But every country, including the Americans, are having their own problem. They're buying uranium from Russia, but they are not, they're banning oil and gas. Inflation rate is very high, and the gas prices are going on. So they have their own compulsion, own dilemmas, like we have ours. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. I see among the audience former Deputy National Security Advisor, Leela Ponappa. Leela, do you want to say something? Leela Ponappa.
Thank you, Surendra. Of course, a lot of what has been said today has been...
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, hang on. Is my video on? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. A lot of what has been said today, partly we've talked about the military situation, there's speculation, comments about India's position, and so on and so forth. And talking about the homilies about being on the right side of history. History always depends on who writes it. We'll have to wait to see what the outcome of all this is. What I see happening really is the total revamp of the post-World War II security order. This is beyond NATO. It's beyond NATO, beyond Ukraine, beyond Russia. It is about how major powers, and the new dimension here, of course, is how China is going to conduct itself in the context of this very interesting statement by the Deputy Foreign Minister that Shyam referred to. It's amazing. But I think these are the realities we have to deal with. For us, of course, the bottom line is, so what about India? Shashi called the UN statement mealy mouth. I thought it was, at that point of time, good. But I think the time has now come to tell both sides, whom we call friends, and friends indeed must speak frankly to each other. Russia had a geopolitical case. It has made its point. The Americans have been talking about this whole expansion of NATO really since the early 2000s. I mean, I remember there were NATO summits when George Bush was president, when I think due caution was exercised. But obviously, there has been a certain provocation and an attempt to try to see how far Russia can be pushed. Putin has established his red lines, and as I said, he has now militarily made his point. It is high time he stopped. And certainly, India must call publicly for the stoppage. Should we sort of jump around the way others do in terms of what is reported in the media? Not necessarily, but we must speak candidly to both sides. Also, I think the China factor, let's not forget that the United States, when it plans militarily, has always thought in terms of a two-front war. I don't know that the pivot that got announced during Obama's time is going to change because of this. Certainly, the whole situation in Europe will be a fillip for the US arms industry. And that's always good for the economy. So I think America will see its interests on both sides, and I would certainly hope that China's emboldenment from this is something that can be kept in check. Net, we are on our own. Nobody came to us to help us at Galwan. And for all the talk about the Quad, it sounds good. It gives scholars and media a lot to write about. But when push comes to shove, we are on our own. And the only way to handle it is by developing our capabilities, by stop being defensive about our defense expenditure. We are a highly underdefended country. And unless something is done about this, without necessarily getting jingoistic, but having these capabilities so that it's not just a question of what percentage of our supplies we get from Russia. A little spare part that does not come on time can affect your capabilities. So I think the agenda has always been there. It's not just now, it has been there for many decades.
Okay.
It's a question of whether we can come to grips with it and get down to business instead of playing politics on these things.
Thank you. Now I will invite all the panelists, 2 minutes each for your closing comments. Start with Suhasini, then Shyam, ending with our friend Shahi Tharoor. Suhasini, your closing comments, last 2 minutes.
Okay, I took more than the extra 2 minutes, so I would just close over here to make the point that I think what we are not realizing is there is a sense that somehow what is happening in Ukraine is something India has weathered in the past, and that we have somehow come through it by a mixture of our non-alignment with what is today referred to as strategic autonomy, and that eventually once there is a ceasefire in the Ukraine, that India can breathe a little easier and continue to do what it has in the past as well. But I think we do need to also recognize that the world has shifted. And since at least 2017, what we are seeing more and more is the need for choices, the need for every country to be made to stand up and pick a side. If you like, the idea that you no longer have what used to be called the a la carte option. I will take this from this side and this from this side. And more countries are being forced into the idea of a buffet. If India wants to buck this trend, then the answer is not going to be everything to all sides. I will be part of the Quad. I will also be part of the SCO. I will also be part of the RIC. I will do the BRICS. But I actually think of the US as my closest strategic partner. At some point or the other, India is going to have to stand up. If it doesn't want to have to choose, then there is only one option, and that is to strengthen the multilateral world order. And unfortunately, this is one place where, and I agree with Mr. Tharoor when he says that this is one place where India could have shown itself. This is one place where the UN itself could have shown itself as much more proactive, much more able. If India wants to make a stand today that does not necessarily mean I'm choosing this side or the other, then that stand has to be to proactively strengthen the global order, whether it is to revise what we saw in the post-World War situation, or whether it is to make an entirely new world order. But I think that's the direction we will have to go. And sooner or later, we will be faced with that choice.
Okay, Shyam. So after Ukraine, what kind of world order are we witnessing? Our friend Shankar said, it's not unipolar world, it's not multipolar, it's a confused world. Now, I don't know, what do you think? What kind of order is there? And I don't know, how are we coping? Can't we really ask for withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine? After all, in Kuwait, we did ask Iraqi troops to withdraw.
Well, when we are talking about the evolution of the international order, I think the Ukraine crisis is certainly demonstrating that, the old rules of the game, the old order no longer exists. I think that much is clear. If you just take, for example, Europe, what has happened, for example, in Germany, that the post-war consensus on keeping a very low military profile, even while building up its economic profile, that has changed. And it has changed perhaps irretrievably. So for Germany to take a decision that it will increase its defense expenditure by more than 2% per annum, that it will supply lethal weapons to a conflict zone, which was a no-no for many, many years. The fact that these decisions were taken by a left-leaning coalition, where we would have normally have not expected this. This is a major change, and I cannot see the European sort of space being the same as it was before. It has changed. Now, the problem is that while we are all saying it is changed, how it is changing, how it will impact us, I'm afraid, I have to admit that I don't know. That is why I refer to the change in the Chinese discourse, where, there is a big shift by beginning to say there is no parallel between Taiwan and Ukraine, to then come back and say, actually, there is a huge parallel between the two. So it's just I think a sign that things are still so fluid that it's very difficult to actually come to any kind of a assessment, a stable kind of an assessment. So let me say this: I take the point that India might find it difficult to sort of stay without leaning this side or that side. I am not quite in agreement with that, because I think we are living in a world where there are many kinds of issues that are confronting us. For dealing with certain kinds of issue, we may have one coalition of countries. We're dealing another kind of issue, we may have another coalition of countries. And I don't think we should find ourselves in a position that we cannot deal with some major challenge because we are committed to a side, an alliance which does not allow me to take care of my interests in some other area. So I would still want that India retains that room for maneuver. It is not, I think, at this point necessary to take the view that we have to go on one side or the other. I think I would still reserve judgment on that issue. Maybe that will happen in the future, but I don't think that time has come yet. I think we still have room for maneuver. And as I mentioned to you, with regard to the Quad, with regard to our relationship with the US, I believe the long-term trend in which the United States of America will find itself under more relative pressure from a more powerful China does give a value to its relationship with India. And I think that we should leverage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Shashi. You have the last word, the former minister of ministry and also chairman of Parliament Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs.
Unmute.
Yeah.
So I said thank you very much, but I think I should decline because I'll merely be repeating myself, which none of us needs. I've made my points. I've listened attentively to the responses and the comments of others. I really no great areas of disagreement, even with Ms. Punnappa's strictures, which I've taken in the right spirit. I think ultimately these are issues in which obviously all of us have points of view. None of us knows how it's going to evolve. I don't think Mr. Putin knows how it's going to evolve. But I do have an op-ed in the Hindu tomorrow suggesting the outlines of a peace settlement. I mean, at some point, this tragedy, this unmitigated horror and destruction have to stop. And we have not talked about the 2.8, now close to 3 million refugees flocking into neighboring countries in Europe. We haven't talked about the ridiculous scale of devastation and destruction and the increasing proportion of civilian casualties. Every day there's a new civilian site. 400 people taking shelter in a theater, 300 people taking shelter in a school. I mean, it's insane the kind of killing that's going on. And I can't even believe that anybody in Russia feels this is worth pursuing. So we do need to pursue, somebody has to pursue a peace. I hope it's Mr. Guterres, if my old fondness for the UN is manifesting itself, there we are. But if not, let somebody, I don't care if it's Naftali Bennett or Shyam Saran, but somebody should go and try and find a formula that can end this needless suffering and destruction. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. You have been so informative. I'm sure most of us benefited from your views. And I'm thankful to all the panelists who have taken time off to join this discussion. And I also thank all the attendees who have really joined, because every television channel is showing so many other things that are more interesting than this discussion. My special thank to some friend, one joined from Chicago University, Dr. Dennis Jorgen, and we have Puneet from New York, and we have some friend from London, and all of you, a big round of applause to our panelists virtually. And I know what Suhasini knows what is in the op-ed of Shahi tomorrow, but I think we will read it tomorrow. Thank you very much. Lovely to have you here. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening, everyone.
You too. Good night.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.